Hello, everyone. This is Giselle. I am a faculty member that works in the Writing Support Center. If you haven't been to a remote workshop before, the way these generally work is that we go through a PowerPoint or a presentation, or we view a video that is related to the topic at hand. As we go through the presentation, there's generally a worksheet attached, which is the case for this workshop. So if you haven't already, please go ahead and pause here and download the worksheet that's associated with this workshop. The reason why we attach a worksheet to each workshop is because we think it helps you process the ideas that are in the workshop a little better. And it's also a way for you to show that you've attended the workshop, just in case your professor asks you to attend a workshop for extra credit. It's a really helpful tool, so go ahead and download that if you haven't already. With that, I'm going to introduce today's workshop, which is called Final Thoughts, Essential Elements of a Conclusion. The main objective of today's workshop is to help you identify and understand the essential elements of a concluding paragraph. So sometimes conclusions are a little confusing and hard to write just because they're the last paragraph of your essay, and sometimes you might feel that you've said everything that can be said. So I'm going to give you some tips today that will hopefully help you write a conclusion with much more ease. Towards the end of this workshop, I'm going to give you some time to practice writing a conclusion, and that practice can be done with a prompt that you currently have assigned to you, or you can also use one of the a prompt that I've written, and you can use that to practice if you're not currently working on a prompt right now. So I just want you to take a couple of minutes to reflect before we get into the nitty-gritty of conclusions. There's a space on the worksheet that you can type on so that you can get your responses recorded. It's a fillable PDF, so you should be able to type into it. But I want you to use a worksheet to reflect on these two questions. What is the purpose of a conclusion? And what do you think are some important elements of a conclusion? So go ahead, think about what you've heard in your previous English courses. Think about what you think goes into a conclusion, and think about what is that purpose in the first place of a conclusion. So go ahead, pause here, and once you're done, we'll continue with the lesson. Okay, so I hope you had enough time to write down a reflection. If not, there's no timer going, so I suggest you just pause here and finish the question. So with that thought in mind, hopefully your answers match somewhat of what I put here, or some version of what I put here. So what should a conclusion do? There's four main things that a conclusion should do. One thing it should do is definitely provide a bridge. What that means is that your conclusion can help your readers see why all your analysis and information should matter to them and their daily lives after they put the paper down. So this bridge that the conclusion provides, let your readers see the bigger picture. You wrote this paper, why does it matter outside of, whatever, like the book or the novel? Why do these ideas matter to the reader, and why should they care? It's essentially a so what. Your conclusion should reveal why the topic at hand is something that people should think about, should ponder about. You also want your conclusion to give a lasting impression. What that means is the conclusion allows you to have the final say on the issues you have raised in your paper, to synthesize your thoughts, to demonstrate the importance of ideas, and to propel your reader to a new view of the subject. So you want, after you've finished your essay and you've written that conclusion, you want your reader to remember the key things that are most important to the paper. So think about that. What sorts of things do you want them to walk away with after they finished reading your paper? Another point is that you want to make your readers glad they read your paper. So your conclusion gives your readers something to take away that will help them see things differently or appreciate your topic in personally relevant ways. So your conclusion is essentially an opportunity for the reader to realize why they're happy they read it. It's something to help them see, like I said, kind of like providing a bridge, the importance of why they read what they read. It should make them, in a sense, not like, oh, I'm so happy I read your paper, but more so that they're glad that they have the information they didn't have before. So it's also showing why the information you've provided is valuable. That's what you're doing in a conclusion anyways. And then the last point is to go beyond the assignment. So what that means is the conclusion pushes beyond the boundaries of the prompt and allows you to consider broader issues, make new connections, and elaborate on the significance of your findings. So this is another thing that you should consider for your conclusion. And that's the whole idea of what bigger issue does your paper inform. It kind of shows a reader why your paper is relevant, and that's sometimes it's hard to do, but essentially it's pushing your conclusion pushes your paper into a place where it shows how it connects to broader issues. So in your conclusion, you could talk about why something why the topic of your paper connects to a bigger issue that you might not have been able to reveal as much in the other parts of your paper. So in your conclusion, you can take the opportunity to do that. Okay, so the next section, I'm going to go through a few different types of conclusions, and I'm giving them, I didn't write this. This is actually from the University of North Carolina, which I'll give you a link to after. But they found clever ways to name the different kind of conclusions we see. So I'm going to give you, on the left in the pink area is going to be a conclusion you don't want to do, and in the right is how you might fix that conclusion. So essentially this section is going to give you a do not and a do for every, or a do not and a way to fix that do not for every one of these slides. So that's pretty much what's going to happen in this next section. So for the first type of conclusion we're covering, it's called "That's my story and I'm sticking to it" conclusion. So this conclusion just restates the thesis and is usually painfully short. It does not push the ideas forward. So what that means is that the conclusion doesn't do anything different. This is the type of conclusion someone might write when they're tired, say they've already put all their energy into the body paragraphs and the introduction, and they feel like they don't have anything else to say. So this is generally what happens. They just restate the thesis, maybe they reword the thesis, or maybe they don't reword the thesis. I've seen students who just put, writing from their introduction word for word in their conclusion. And that's a big no-no. Just because this doesn't push the ideas forward, it doesn't give those bigger picture ideas that your reader should be getting from the conclusion, as I mentioned in the previous slide. So an example of this sort of "that's my story and I'm sticking to it" conclusion is, in conclusion, Frederick Douglass was, as we have seen, a pioneer in American education, proving that education was a major force for social change with regard to slavery. So this isn't necessarily a bad conclusion. It just doesn't give us much depth. And I would imagine this is probably very similar to their introduction. It's probably also shorter than their introduction because the writer probably didn't want to repeat themselves so much. Another big no-no that isn't mentioned here is that the usage of "in conclusion" is very repetitive. Your reader knows this is your concluding paragraph, or they should know based on how it's written. And using something like "in conclusion" is just clunky and not necessary. So I would refrain from using "in conclusion" when writing your last paragraph. If you do want like a big concluding statement, consider something like "ultimately," or I think "ultimately" would be a good one. Just do not use the words "in conclusion" or "concluding" or anything about conclusions in your last paragraph, just because it's too over the head. So if you do find yourself in this boat where you're having a hard time pushing yourself to write anything beyond what you wrote in your introduction, one method you can use to get you past that point is called playing the so what game. So if you feel like your conclusion isn't saying anything new or interesting, what you can do is ask a friend, or in this case, just ask yourself to say, so what? Ponder that question and then answer the so what. As you answer that so what question, you will then get more answers. It will give you the reason why your paper is important, essentially. So if you do not have a so what, that probably means your conclusion is incomplete. So an example of playing the so what game is below. So you could say, basically, I'm just saying that education was important to Douglas. So what? Well, it was important because it was a key to him feeling like a free and equal citizen. Why should anyone care? That's important because plantation owners tried to keep slaves from being educated so that they could maintain control. When Douglas obtained an education, he undermined that control. So you can see just by looking at the two extra questions, or the two so whats, a much more robust conclusion is created. So if this writer just incorporated something like proving that education was a major force for social change with regard to slavery, they could add, this is important because it was a key to feeling, helping commonly disenfranchised people to feel like free and equal citizens, which was important during the time of slavery because those who weren't educated were being kept under control by those who were. So if you were to add something like this into the conclusion, it would be much stronger. So just asking yourself, so what, when you can't think of something else, is an easy way to help make your conclusion more robust. Okay, so for this next conclusion we're going to talk about, they've nicknamed it the Sherlock Holmes conclusion. So sometimes writers will state the thesis for the very first time in the conclusion, leaving the reader in the dark until the end, like a Sherlock Holmes mystery. The reader, however, does not expect a mystery, but an analytical discussion of your topic in an academic style, with the main argument stated up front. So this is super important. Your conclusion should never be the first time you say your thesis statement. Your thesis statement should always be in your introduction. So if you realize that you've put your thesis statement in the conclusion, it's probably very smart to move that thesis statement into your conclusion. Your reader wants to feel guided through the paper. So that's why you give them the conclusion up front. It gives them the main idea of the entire paper, so they know where the paper is going. And then in the body paragraphs, you engage them in an analytical and academic way about the topic at hand. You provide them evidence, and in the conclusion is where you actually wrap up that evidence you brought up, wrap up that analytical discussion you started. That's what the conclusion should do. It should definitely not be introducing your thesis at that point. So an example of this would be, in parentheses, after a paper that lists numerous incidents from the book, but never says that these incidents reveal about Douglas and his views on education. The person might say something like, so as the evidence above demonstrates, Douglas saw education as a way to undermine the slaveholders' power and also an important step toward freedom. So essentially what this person might have done is they might have given all their reasoning, and then in that last paragraph is finally where they tell the reader what they should be thinking about when they're reading through this information. So that's really confusing for the reader, because the reason why you put the thesis up front, another reason at least, is because you're telling the reader you're supposed to be looking at my evidence in this way. So if your reader doesn't know how to assess the evidence, they're probably going to be confused the entire time they're going through the paper. And it's not best for them to realize at the end that that is why you listed all this evidence. Again, your conclusion shouldn't be like a Sherlock Holmes mysteries. While mysteries are entertaining, it's definitely not entertaining for an analytical paper. So in order to avoid having one of these Sherlock Holmes conclusions, instead what you should do is return to the theme or the themes in the introduction. So first you have to make sure that your thesis and your theme is in the introduction. And once you've done that, you can use this strategy because it brings the reader full circle. For example, if you begin by describing a scenario, you can end with the same scenario as proof that your essay is helpful in creating a new understanding. You may also refer to the introductory paragraph by using keywords or parallel concepts that you also used in the introduction. So you can borrow from your introduction paragraph, especially if what you're borrowing are the concepts and the keywords. You don't want to write it down word for word, but you can use these concepts and keywords to make a point. And again, you can also do that thing where maybe you start with one scenario and then at the end you continue talking about that scenario, but you give the reader a new perspective of how they could think about that scenario. So that's another way to make sure that you're actually stating the thesis in the beginning and not at the end. This is just one strategy to do that. Okay, so another type of conclusion is the quote, America the Beautiful, I am woman, we shall overcome, end quote conclusion. This kind of conclusion usually draws on emotion to make its appeal, but while this emotion and even sentimentality may be very heartfelt, it is usually out of character with the rest of an analytical paper. A more sophisticated commentary rather than emotional praise would be a more fitting tribute to the topic. So I've seen this is probably the one I've seen the most, is when students try to end their paper with an emotional appeal. For an analytical paper, especially if you're writing a research paper, this does not go with the tone of that paper. You definitely don't want to end on a quote. Quotes always need explanation, so even if it's an inspirational quote, it should not be put into the conclusion. All quotes should always go into body paragraphs because you do need to provide the explanation of the quote. You need to connect the quote to your paper, to your thesis. So because you're not supposed to be doing that in a conclusion, quotes should definitely stay out of a conclusion. An example of this type of conclusion reads as follows. Because of the efforts of fine Americans like Frederick Douglass, countless others have seen the shining beacon of light that is education. His example was a torch that lit the way for others. Frederick Douglass was truly an American hero. So this might actually, using this emotional appeal might actually hurt someone's credibility. It's another reason why you don't want to use the emotional appeal in your last paragraph. Some of the things that show that this is more emotional is using adjectives like fine Americans. That word fine really paints this in a certain way. It really gives it a more inspirational, hopeful voice. And while that tone isn't exactly a bad tone, it just does not go into an analytical essay. Also, describing him as the shining beacon of light, or describing education as a shining beacon of light, sounds very poetic. Again, not a suitable tone for an analytical paper. And then torch that lit the way for others. Again, very beautiful language is being used here, but it is just not appropriate for an analytical paper. So be very mindful of that when you are writing your final conclusion or your conclusion. Definitely stray from the emotional appeal. Instead, what you can do is point to broader implications. So this strategy will allow your reader to understand the importance of your topic without using that emotional appeal. So for example, if your paper examines the Greensboro sit-ins and another event in the civil rights movement, you could point out its impact on the civil rights movement as a whole. A paper about the style of writer Virginia Woolf could point to her influence on other writers or on later feminists. So remember earlier when we talked about go beyond the assignment? Pointing to broader implications is a way to go beyond the assignment. So like I said, if you're talking about the Greensboro sit-ins, you could point to the civil rights movement as a whole and how this impacted and moved forward the civil rights movement. Or like it says here, like if you're writing about a feminist writer, you can talk about their influence to other feminist writers, in this case, Virginia Woolf. So that's what I mean when pointing to broader implications. You can talk about how your topic has affected other things in a positive or negative way, whatever it may be. But you can show how your topic works in the real world. Doing that, pointing to broader implications, is much more effective than using an emotional appeal. So if you find that you are likely to do this emotional appeal, try doing this instead. So another type of conclusion is nicknamed the grab bag conclusion. So this kind of conclusion includes extra information that the writer found or thought of, but couldn't integrate into the main paper. So this happens when you have too many ideas. So say you've written a lot of paragraphs and you're at the page limit. So you've already written past the minimum and now you're at that last page limit number. And you still have a lot of great information. At this point, it's probably smarter to think about what you do and don't need. So if you do have extra information, don't just put it in the conclusion. Maybe re-examine your body paragraphs and think about what is important in your body paragraphs, what can go, what needs to stay, and do you need that extra information you haven't written about? Is it absolutely necessary for your reader in order for them to understand your argument? If it's not essential for your reader to understand your argument, I would recommend just cutting that information or integrating it into the main paper if you do have the space, but definitely do not put it in the conclusion. An example of this would be, in addition to being an educational pioneer, Frederick Douglass provides an interesting case study for masculinity in the American South. He also offers historians an interesting glimpse into slave resistance when he confronts Covey, the overseer. His relationships with female relatives reveal the importance of family in the slave community. So this is a big no-no. As you can see from this paragraph, these are one, two, three ideas that are completely different from one another. Each one of these ideas could probably be their own paper. This talks about masculinity in the South. This talks about slave resistance. And this talks about the importance of family in the slave community. All three great ideas, all three completely different, all three requiring their own paper. So you definitely do not want to do a grab bag conclusion. While these are great points, writing them into the conclusion is not good for the paper. It's not an effective move. So I would tell this writer to just cut these things. So if you do run into this problem and you have to cut a lot of your conclusion, one thing you can do instead is to synthesize, don't summarize. What that means is to include a brief summary of the paper's main points, but don't simply repeat things that were in your paper. Instead, you can show your reader how the points you made and the support and examples you used fit together. It's a chance where you get to pull it all together. So essentially, don't repeat what you said in the conclusion or in the introduction, but you can synthesize the main points. So what that means is you can look at each one of your body paragraphs and decide, okay, this is the main point. This helped me build my main point in this way. Let me synthesize that information. So let me think about my main points in my body paragraphs so that I can synthesize it and then talk about how these examples fit together to prove the conclusion. So that's much more effective than just simply summarizing or just throwing a bunch of ideas together. So this is one great way to conclude your essay. Another great way. Okay, so thinking about the things that we just went over, I want you to think about how you could improve this sample conclusion. So we're going to read through the conclusion, or rather, I'm going to read the conclusion to you. And I want you to identify what issues are present. You can call it any one of the ones that we went through. So you could say this conclusion is a grab bag conclusion, or it's an America the Beautiful conclusion. So you can use that wording that we've used throughout the paragraph, throughout the presentation. But just identify the issues. You don't have to do that either. You could just identify what issues there are. And then how would you apply some of the strategies we just went over so that you can improve it? So this is the thesis of the paper, just so you have an idea of what the paper is supposed to be about. Teachers are an essential part of every educational institution since they teach students important subject matter, which means well-qualified instructors should be paid a higher wage. So that's just the thesis. It gives you an idea of what this paper is about. Obviously, this paper is about how teachers are important and how this person is arguing that they need a higher wage. So this conclusion reads, in conclusion, without well-qualified teachers, students can't be taught important subject matter. I believe they should get paid more, especially if they are well-qualified since schools need good teachers. As a famous quote says, education is a passport to the future, for tomorrow belongs to those who prepare for it today. Okay, so just look at this conclusion and think about what issues are present and what you might do to improve it. So go ahead and take a couple minutes to do this question. It's number 2 on your worksheet, I believe. And you can go ahead and pause, and once you are done, we will continue. Okay, so I hope you had enough time to review the conclusion and think about what might be wrong with it. When I look at it, I think the most obvious thing, the first thing I see at least is the in conclusion, right? Again, you don't want to use this, it's repetitive. Instead, the writer could use something like ultimately, or they could even use nothing like that, and they could just start with without well-qualified teachers. So this should definitely, in conclusion, should definitely be taken out. Another thing that this conclusion does is that it repeats the introduction. In the introduction, this person says that well-qualified instructors should be paid a higher wage, and then this person says students can't be taught important subject matter. I believe they should get paid more, especially if they're well-qualified. So again, it's repeating the thesis in this case, and it's repeating it without using the same exact words, but still using very similar words. And they actually repeat themselves in this sentence and this sentence. So it's just repetitive all around. And it ends on a quote. So education is a passport to the future, for tomorrow belongs to those who prepare for it today. I would argue this quote doesn't quite relate to the rest of the essay. So not only are they ending on a quote when you should never end on a quote, they're also providing a quote that does not relate to the rest of the conclusion. So with the repetition up here, they're doing the whole "that's my story" type of conclusion. So this one, "that's my story and I'm sticking to it" conclusion, because the paragraph is very short and it doesn't push the ideas forward, right? So what this person could have done is they could have played the "so what" game. They could have asked themselves, why well-qualified school teacher, why well-qualified, why teachers are needed at schools, or well-qualified teachers are needed at schools. So they could have asked themselves, so what? So why do schools need well-qualified teachers? Well, well-qualified teachers will provide, you know, a higher level of education than a teacher who's not well-qualified. And then to keep teachers who are well-qualified, paying a higher wage will give them more incentive. So just asking themselves, so what, will lead to a better conclusion. It'll give them more ideas as to what to write. Also, like I said, this quote has nothing to do with the rest of the paragraph. It's definitely a sort of mixture of America the Beautiful, like trying to be emotionally appealing to the reader, but also a grab bag type of conclusion, since it doesn't present any new ideas and is presenting, or it doesn't present um, an idea that's related to the topic. Instead, it's presenting a new idea. So it's very confusing because it's talking about education so generally. Uh, it's not really talking about teachers themselves. So I would say just cut this quote, and instead the person could just point to broader implications. Um, Maybe the state of um, education in the US in comparison to other schools. It could be something talking about the education system in general, but definitely not a quote. Um, this definitely does not relate to the paragraph, so I would just cut this. But that's how they could revise it. They could definitely synthesize and not summarize by providing a brief summary of the main points, which I think they tried to do, but they didn't do it effectively. They could do this more effectively by asking themselves, so what? And again, no quotes in the conclusion. But that's how you could improve this and make it a bit longer. Okay, so for the last part of this workshop, I want you to use some time to revise or write a conclusion for one of the essays you're currently assigned. If you don't have an assignment, you can also write a conclusion using the sample introduction for context. So the sample introduction reads, do you use social media, apps, or YouTube? Modern American youth are flooded with opportunities to access information and entertainment, often at the touch of a fingertip. Although many of these technological outlets have a negative connotation of wasted brain space, not all technology and screen time should be considered mindless entertainment. In fact, because of technology's widespread appeal and accessibility, it can be easily used to incorporate academic or educational purpose into daily routine. The use of technology and screen time can be positive for children as it allows children to excel academically by expanding definitions of classrooms and literacy as a whole and supplementing in-class education. So this is a very robust introduction. You can use this introduction as a guiding point to write a sample conclusion. But again, this is a great reason or a great time for you to just use a prompt that you are assigned or to revise a conclusion you've already written. So you can do any one of these three things, either write for a current essay assigned to you, revise a previous conclusion, or just create a new conclusion using this introduction as a guiding point. So go ahead and do that. This is actually the end of the workshop, so you can do that. And you can rewind this workshop to see the different strategies to help you out while you write that conclusion. I also have one more thing to leave you with before we log off. As I said, this workshop was created based on the UNC, the Writing Center at UNC Tips and Tools conclusion. So I'm going to pull that up for you so that you can see what that looks like. So the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill has a lot of great resources. If you haven't already been here, I suggest you visit this website. Again, it's writingcenter.unc.edu. This specific one is the conclusions page that I drew much of the workshop from. But there's actually a lot of great tools on this website that you can use for other questions you may have. Our Writing Center, our Canvas page has a lot of handouts too, and you can use those. But if there's a topic that you need help with and we don't have, I would suggest you come to this website. So under the Tips and Tools button, there's quite a few articles on different parts of the writing process, citation, writing for specific fields. So if you're from a different field or you have a class in a different field and you need help with that sort of writing, you can also come here. So I just wanted to show you all this resource in case you need more resources as you're working or as you're working and going to school from home. But this is definitely a great one if you need more writing help. So I hope you found today's workshop helpful, and I hope you join us for the next one. Thanks.